It's a great pleasure to see such a really interesting conference with such a lot of good discussion. And I think we will try to keep this discussion going. We have there are many issues that have been brought up, issues about the different strategies that can be focused on to reduce emissions, to reduce energy usage. And we have four extremely distinguished experts, and I'd like to ask each of them to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, short, focused on issues. And then these things will come up in questions the way it's been doing all day. So let's start. I would like to introduce Professor Uzawa, whose work I began to read in the 1950s, and who has been a beacon, a leading light in the theory of and practice of economic growth. So, Professor Uzawa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm repeating what I said yesterday. That is that the theory, or basic conceptual framework of optimum economic growth, of which I was part of funding the theory, is in great mess, in the sense that if you want to have an institutional arrangement whereby, in which the optimum economic growth could be attained, then that is accomplished by the introduction of competitive market system combined with perfect foresight. And these basic premises are not applicable to the problems of global warming and other related subjects. So I think that we have to make a substantial modification on the basic premises of optimum economic growth. The alternative concept I have been proposing is that of the sustainable economic development. That is, imputed price of, say, CO2 in the atmosphere would be defined at the sustainable level if it remains at that level in a very short period of time. And that, to explain that, suppose that we consider a hypothetical virtual capital market in which CO2 would be transacted, though with negative price, and then the optimum economic growth assumes that the level of imputed price would be optimum for the entire future. And assuming that future economic conditions will be known for certain at the time when calculation is made. But the alternative concept of sustainable level of the imputed price is defined that it would remain at the same at that level for the very short time period, starting with that period t. That means that this mathematically that we solve that the imputed price p t dot with respect to the hypothetical time of the virtual capital market. And that only at time t, and if we solve that, then we can, it is possible to define or calculate the sustainable level of imputed price at that particular moment in time with the knowledge on economic conditions, and at that time, without knowing anything about the future conditions. And this in a more standard use of the word, that is, we equate our level of investment, we adjust level of investment in such a manner that marginal efficiency of investment is equated to real rate of interest using the social rate of interest. And then it is possible to come out with the path of economic development approaching a time to go to infinity to the long run stationary states. Identical with that for perfect foresight hypothesis. And this, if I apply this concept of sustainable processes of economic development, then the sustainable level processes of sustainable patterns of atmospheric accumulation of CO2 would be attained if the arrangement of the proportional carbon tax schemes are introduced together with the market system of perfect competition. And this would make it possible that for each country in the world to attain the sustainable processes of economic development, each different from other countries' processes of sustainable economic development. And, but this will not be enough to solve the serious problem of divergence between developed countries and developing countries. So I add to this proportional carbon tax scheme what I call the atmospheric stabilization fund, or atmospheric international fund for atmospheric stabilization, whereby each country contribute, say, 5% of the next net receipt from this scheme of proportional carbon tax arrangement to contribute to this fund, which will be allocated in turn to developing countries. And the combination of, well, this proportional carbon tax scheme with the international arrangement of stabilization fund would make the processes of economic development in the world to be harmonious and sustainable. And this would be attained, would be made possible without very difficult calculation of the processes of optimum economic growth. Thank you.
Just a quick reminder, sort of overview of what we're trying to accomplish this panel. We have had, during the course of the 2 days, suggestions for managing the problem of emissions and climate control in order to deal with global warming based on price. Price taxes, price as a monopoly, market solutions. We have had subsidies suggested. We have had taxes suggested, controls. We have had a pseudo-market, cap and trade, suggested. We have had suggestions as to the redirection of investment to less carbon-intensive sectors. And we have had new technologies suggested. I think that somewhat surveys most of the things that have been proposed. Now, what we are doing is we are reviewing these, and we are going to, in a sense, open the question of debating these. Our next speaker is Professor von Weizsaecker, who comes from an extremely famous family in Germany, which, interestingly enough, has a bit of a connection to the New School, since the founder of the economics department at the New School in the 1930s was Adolf Low. And Adolf Low was a very close friend of a member of this family. And when he left Germany, he was dismissed on his birthday in 1933, and he returned to Germany on his birthday in 1983, and he was met by the then President of the Republic, a member of the von Weizsaecker family. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor von Weizsaecker.
Thank you very much. And I thought to come into the discussion mode, I stay here.
Yes.
And you know, this morning I had a chance of speaking for half an hour or more, but there were not half as many people in the room as there are now. In particular, the panelists weren't here. So I thought it might be healthy if I also repeat kind of what I was saying this morning, resonating, however, with some of the things you have been saying. Let me start by definitely agreeing with Professor Uzawa's notion that we need a fundamental change in our understanding of economics, benefits, and definitely also agreeing with him on the need for carbon taxes. Let me start from there and say the kind of vision that I was proposing under the title of a 5-fold increase of energy productivity or resource productivity means that we should engineer a paradigm shift in the understanding, in the notion of productivity. The world has seen 5 big cycles of economic growth and technology innovation, sometimes referred to as Kondratiev cycles, which had one thing in common from early mechanization to the internet, namely a systematic increase of labor productivity. A fabulous story of success, that labor productivity would increase 20-fold over the early days, which definitely is the basis of our wealth today. And the other common property of those cycles is basically a neglect of environmental limits. It was all expansion, understandably so, but no longer available, given the climate restrictions, biodiversity, land, given the fact that we are nearing 7 billion people. So, in that book, Factor 5, we are advocating the creation of a sixth technological and growth cycle characterized by resource productivity. Meaning, we can and should increase the economic value and the amount of well-being, if that can be measured, fivefold at least, in the long term tenfold, 20-fold, of what we can extract from 1 kilowatt hour or from 1 cubic meter of water or perhaps 1 square meter of land or from 1 ton of mineral ores. And we are able to prove at this time that a fivefold increase is available using today's technologies. And the question is, why is it not happening? And basically the answer is that still in our days of nearly 1 billion unemployed in the world, labor is expensive and labor rationalization is extremely profitable, while resource rationalization is not. And this is the tragedy. We are running in the wrong direction. If you ask an investor where to put her or his money, they would say, of course, technological progress, doing more labor productivity. Now, that then leads to one of the ideas, again in that book, chapter 9, of what we call an eternal ecological tax reform, saying, like we had the experience with labor productivity, that prices should go up step by step by step in line with productivity gains. Gross wages went up in line with labor productivity, which was understandable and good and benign and everything. At the time when, over the last 200 years, primary resources, including energy, got cheaper, not more expensive. And if we then politically begin to agree, starting perhaps in China or in Germany, to actively raise energy prices, socially benign, doing it in line with energy productivity gains. So if the car fleet becomes 2% more fuel efficient in this year, it's not social hardship to say in 2011 car fuels should be 2% more expensive. That is fine. And that would make the car manufacturers speed up their efficiency trail and would make infrastructure planners going into public transport, mass transport, and many other things. The state should not play the role of the engineer. The state should play the role of setting the right frame so that investors and engineers and consumers and traders move in the right direction. And then I believe 50 years from now, a factor of 5 would be available, would be there, and all those cumbersome discussions that we have seen in the Copenhagen climate discussion would kind of evaporate. People would say, well, we can easily do an 80% reduction in carbon dioxide in the rich countries, and in the poor countries we can stabilize them while at the same time increasing their wealth fivefold. So I believe it is good for climate, good for prosperity, and good for North-South equity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Nathaniel Keohane, and he is Director of Economic Policy and Analysis, Environmental and Defense Fund. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think my designated role, I think, to some extent, is to buck the trend and the conventional wisdom among economists and present the argument for a cap-and-trade system, focusing on the U.S., but thinking also internationally. And the arguments I'll give here are largely taken from an article I published last year, about a year ago, in the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy. Happy to give that to anybody who wishes. So I want to start from the premise. I had a bunch of slides, but I'm going to abandon them following the wisdom of my fellow panelists, and they largely serve to get my thoughts in order anyways. So I want to start from, I think, a common premise, which is that from an economic perspective, and this is one that we discussed yesterday as well, that Michael Greenstone actually surprisingly said he was sort of pessimistic about it, but Michael Oppenheimer was more optimistic, and we've heard it throughout. I want to start from the premise that to solve this problem, to solve climate change, or to tackle it effectively, we need a carbon price. We need to align the economic incentives with the social costs of emitting greenhouse gases. And we need to do that because fundamentally, market incentives and economic incentives are the only force we have that's powerful enough to harness the kind of capital flows, the investment, the innovation, the technological change needed at the scale that's needed, at the pace and the magnitude that's needed to solve this problem. The question I want to address is, how do we get that price? Because there are two fundamental ways, from an economist's point of view, there are two fundamental instruments we can use to set that price. And this is the distinction between a carbon tax and a cap-and-trade system. So if you look out in the world, if you looked at legislation for a cap-and-trade program versus legislation, which is much rarer, for a carbon tax, I haven't actually seen any, and that's a point I'll come back to. I haven't seen any make it to a committee or a floor. But the point is, if you looked at proposals, there are lots of differences, and they all might seem salient. But the fundamental difference, because in general, you can design a tax to do a lot of what a cap-and-trade program would do, and you can design a cap-and-trade program to do what a tax would do. For example, on revenues, they can both raise revenues for government, they can both disperse them to entities in the economy. The fundamental difference between a cap-and-trade program and a tax program is that the tax sets the price and the cap-and-trade program sets the quantity. This is what Marty Weitzman 35 years ago termed the problem of prices versus quantities. So under a tax, the government sets the price of carbon, and the market response is what determines emissions. Under a cap-and-trade program, the government sets the target, the cumulative target. In the case of a U.S. cap-and-trade program, that would be a cumulative target over several decades. The government sets that target, and the market response determines the price. So how should we think about this, and why should we think, or why might we think, that a cap-and-trade program is better? So let me give you 5 categories of arguments. The first is that we know that cap-and-trade works. We have a very successful program in this country to control acid rain, to control sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants. It was the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments then the program began in 1995. It's been extraordinarily effective at solving acid rain. You don't read about acid rain anymore. And that's because we cut emissions in half. We did it 3 years ahead of schedule, and we did it at 30% of the projected price. And the way we did it was with an emissions trading program. So that's the first source of success. We've also seen success in the NOx budget program for nitrogen oxides in electric utilities in the U.S. And I will argue, and I'm sure I will get I will get pushback from my fellow panelists and from the audience, but I will argue that the EU ETS has largely been a success. Not as successful as it could have been, but it certainly shows the potential of a cap-and-trade program. Now, of course, there have been programs like the Reclaim program that haven't worked as well. And so no program is going to be perfect. But we do have a proven record of success, especially in this country, and that's the first argument to go on. In contrast, we have not seen anywhere a pollution tax that has been used and successfully reduced pollution. Second point, U.S. political economy. So I'm an economist, but I'm an economist by training, but my day job now spends most of my time on the Hill or in conversations with Hill staff. So I think I can talk a little bit about the U.S. political economy, and there's several points I would make here about not just the political feasibility of a cap-and-trade program versus a tax, but also what you get out of it. So the first point, which is a point that's made a lot, is that in the U.S. political system, a tax is often a four-letter word. And so that, I think, is a valid point, although it's not determinative. I do think that the politics of a tax are very difficult in this country. But, of course, we're also seeing the politics of cap-and-trade are no piece of cake. And that's something I'll come back to in a minute. But the point is that a tax is a very difficult, at least in the frame of the U.S., and it's different elsewhere. A tax is a very different, raises very difficult hurdles to surpass. But more important, I would say, than that, the political discussion is different. The nature of the discussion is different under a tax than a cap-and-trade program. Under a tax, the discussion is about what the price should be. It's about what the costs are that we're willing to bear. It's about what the dollar amount should be that we're willing to charge consumers. That's what the salient frame is. A cap-and-trade program is about, and a discussion about a cap is a discussion about security. It's a discussion about what the future looks like. It's a discussion about the amount of emissions that are safe. Now, of course, that's a kind of an advocate's point of view embedded in there about which of those discussions you'd prefer, but there is a fundamental difference in the political economy of those discussions. Beyond that, I think a cap-and-trade program in terms of the politics encourages greater coverage and greater scope. It's, I would argue, the fact that with a cap-and-trade program you have a ready-made distributional instrument, which is handing out allowances for free, which a lot of people don't like. They turn up their noses at that. But the fact is, by handing out allowances, you can keep entities under the cap, you can keep them in the program and keep them in the economic incentives, while still essentially in the political process, buying them off, at least for a transition. In a tax, I think there's much more of an incentive to exempt people from the program altogether, which restricts the coverage and undermines cost effectiveness. A cap-and-trade program over time will create winners and losers, which is another political point that's very important. So a cap-and-trade program with banking will create firms who then have a vested interest in the continuation and perhaps even the increased stringency of the cap-and-trade program, and you don't get that under a tax. Okay, so political feasibility and political sustainability. Before I move on, let me just mention, because I know this will come up, and you may have read it in the papers, that cap-and-trade is dead. Lindsey Graham has said cap-and-trade is dead, the senator from South Carolina. Michael Greenstone put that up on the slide. I would just say that whether you think cap-and-trade is dead depends on what you mean by cap-and-trade and what you mean by dead. And in particular, cap-and-trade, as it's thought of by senators, is something very specific. It is a 1,600-page bill called Waxman-Markey that was passed in the House. And that is not going to pass in the Senate. But if you define cap-and-trade as a program with a quantitative limit on emissions that's driven, and where the emissions reductions are driven by economic incentives with a carbon price that's created by the market in response to that cap, that's very much alive and well. Now, whether it will pass this year, that's another speculative question we could talk about. But that structure is very much alive and well. Okay, that was a lot on the politics, so let me move on a little bit more briskly. My third point is about international harmonization. Now, I said this was U.S. politics, but from my perspective, we also need to be thinking about, as Michael Greenstone showed yesterday, if the U.S. going it alone is not going to solve anything. I should put it aside. It's not a question about the U.S. going alone because the EU is already doing something. So the U.S. plus the EU still isn't solving the problem. We need to get, as we've seen many times in this conference, we need to get the developing countries participating. So why a cap and trade? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, I think there's a kind of magnetic force of markets. I think if you create a cap and trade program in this country, and then you say to the rest of the world, here is a $100 billion market. And if you follow if you do the following things, if you play by the following rules, you can sell into that market. You have emissions reductions opportunities. Those are gold. Take advantage of them. Sell them to us. I think that's a very powerful attractor, and it's a very powerful process of bringing the other countries in versus, hey, we have a carbon tax. Why don't you guys put a carbon tax on? Now, other people might debate that, but I also think that there's much greater opportunity for bringing in other opportunities for emissions reductions in a cap-and-trade program. A cap-and-trade program lends itself, for example, to accepting credits for emissions reductions from tropical forest, from reducing the deforestation rates in the tropics. Now, we can talk about how effective you can make a RED program, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, but I think there are ways to do it that are very effective, and it's much harder to do that in the context of a tax, I think, than in the context of a cap-and-trade program. Finally, a cap-and-trade program on an international scale provides what I would call cost-effectiveness without coordination. And what I mean by that is, to get a cost-effective solution on the international scale, we have to have a common marginal cost, a common price on emissions across countries. I will submit it would be extraordinarily difficult to have every country, or even a large number of countries, agree on a common price, which is what you would require for a harmonized carbon tax. But if you have a system of cap-and-trade programs, they don't even need to be all created at once under a grand architecture like Kyoto. They could be linked domestic cap-and-trade programs, and just by linking those cap-and-trade programs, the prices will converge and harmonize, and you'll get that cost effectiveness without the difficulties of international coordination. I'm going to merge my fourth and my fifth, or I'll treat the fourth one as a way station to the fifth, because I know I'm close to out of time. The fourth one is about information. We don't know what the right cost of carbon is in terms of economic damages. There is an order of magnitude or more, different, 2 orders of magnitude difference in the 95th, the 5th to 95th percentile of the very best estimates of the social cost of carbon. We don't know, even to reach a given target, we don't know what the right price is we don't know what the marginal abatement cost curve is. And the estimates of the price needed to achieve a Waxman-Markey legislation, for example, also vary pretty widely. We do have some sense, although there's a huge amount of uncertainty, we have some sense of the kind of emissions targets that we would need to avoid, or at least give us a reasonable chance of avoiding various temperature limits. Now, there's certainly a huge amount of uncertainty there, but the point about information is that as long as we think that our ultimate goal ought to be defined in terms of concentrations and cumulative emissions, then using a tax or using a price adds a huge layer of uncertainty onto reaching that target. And this brings me to my fifth and final point, which is, how should we think about this problem? Should we think about this problem as a price problem where we know the government ought to be setting the price and let's see what happens to emissions? Or should we think about it as a quantity problem? Now, if you asked 10 economists in academia, and I used to be one of them, whether this is a price or quantities problem, probably 8 would say this is a prices problem. And certainly if Bill Nordhaus were here, he would make that argument very strongly. But I'm going to disagree. The literature, first of all, the literature that's founded, or the literature that supports that argument, it turns out when you look at the literature, they all use the same damage function that Nordhaus came up with 20 years ago, which is a pretty smooth damage function with no threshold effects and no tipping points. They also use what I would term to be pretty high rates of discount, which makes a big difference when you look at the prices versus quantities problem. And fundamentally, none of them include banking in an allowance program. They all think about a tax versus a year-to-year annual quota, which is something that nobody has proposed for climate. So when you look at threshold effects, which I think the science tells us are part of the damage function, if you look at the possibility of tipping points, and you think about an allowance, a cap-and-trade program that would have banking, I think it becomes much more likely, and actually I can come up with some numbers, and this is in the paper, that under some plausible numbers, this actually becomes, even by the classic criteria, this becomes a quantity problem. So I think the conventional wisdom is actually founded on some pretty weak premises. And when I think about this as a thresholds problem and a tipping problem and a fundamentally fat tail risk problem, that tells me at least this is a problem where we want to think about quantities. Now I want to just say there's a hidden assumption or a key assumption in there that we could talk about. And that assumption has to do with the relevant time horizon. If we think this is a problem, a policy problem where we can reset the policy every year, so every year Congress can go and set what the right policy is according to the latest science, then I think it would be very hard to make an argument that you ought to have a quantity that's set every year. But I would argue this is not that kind of problem. This is a problem that's going to be very sticky. And once we put a framework in place, we are going to be living with that framework for a long time. And in that situation, I think this is a quantity problem rather than a price. So on the grounds of proven success, on the grounds of U.S. political economy, on the grounds of coordination, of cost effectiveness without coordination, on the grounds of information, and on thinking about this in economic terms as prices versus quantities, those are the arguments I give for a cap and trade program. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good, very articulate, very elegant, and very likely to provoke some disagreement from Charlie Komanoff, whom I have known for many, many years, but see very seldom. And it's great to see you.
Thank you.
Very good.
In the spirit of the panel, I'm also going to dispense with slides, but not with some debate with my colleague, Nathaniel. And I do want it to be said for the record that in the 70s and 80s, I was a consultant for the Environmental Defense Fund on a number of issues, expert witness, et cetera. And before I sort of launch into our cap versus tax discussion, where I might be a little bit confrontational, hopefully not too much, I want to sort of prepare the ground by expressing my admiration for Dr. von
Just Ernst, that's much easier.
Thank you for Ernst's elegant formulation of the rising productivity of energy, and that it should be reflected in a rising price in the same sense that the rising productivity of labor has been reflected, although, as I think you would be the first to agree, only with the political power of labor organizing in order to get a social and political recognition and expression of its rising value. And I'm sort of, my mind is kind of racing to think of capital, labor, and energy, and of course it would be in the interest of capital to, as it has been in the interest of capital to suppress the rising price of labor, and continues to be, it will also be in the interest of capital to suppress a rising price for energy. So we have a kind of epic three-cornered battle, but I appreciate that formulation. Well, Nathaniel had 5 kind of reasons to support a cap over a tax. I have 73 reasons, no, just kidding. But I do have a bunch, and I'll try to sort of deal with mine at the same time I'm responding to his. I'm actually going to go back to the winter of 1972 and 1973, which is kind of my origin myth of how I came to be a carbon taxer. At that time, I was a lowly quantitative analyst for the New York City Environmental Protection Administration, which is now the New York City DEP. This was the winter before the Arab oil embargo and the OPEC price increase, but it was the kind of final stage of the implementation of a local law that had been enacted in New York City several years earlier, I think in 1970, that was ratcheting down the permissible sulfur content of fuel oil in New York City. And of course, fuel oil was then the dominant fuel overwhelmingly for the heating of buildings and for electricity generation. And the sulfur content all through the 60s was kind of 2%, and it was ratcheted down to 1%. And finally, in the final stage, it was to be 0.3% sulfur content in the oil, which of course would be a big reduction in pollution, not only sulfur dioxide, but also particulate emissions, which are kind of consistent with the sulfur emissions. In October, November of 72, just as the heating season was beginning, and this local law was about to go into its final stage, the big oil companies came into the city EPA and said, we're not going to be able to meet this deadline. There's been a huge fire in a huge oil refinery in Curacao, which has all this desulfurization equipment. The sweet crude, what we were counting on from Nigeria and Indonesia, it's being siphoned off by California. On and on, a series of problems that were not specious. I mean, these were serious problems. And the city was in a bind because we didn't want to freeze in the dark. Politically, the Lindsay administration, if any of you are old enough to remember, didn't want to be blamed for that. And at the same time, we wanted to protect the public health and uphold the law that we had fought for tenaciously, or the agency and the advocates had fought for. And lo and behold, a sort of magical solution evolved, which was the idea to find out what was the market differential between the clean oil and the dirty oil. Because the clean oil was more expensive, and to impose a fee. We couldn't call it a tax because a tax would have required Albany, and you know what that means. But a fee could be imposed via home rule by the city of New York. And so the city did impose and implement a fee that was a little bit greater than the differential. The differentials sound very quaint. They were 75 cents a barrel, like 2 cents a gallon. And the city imposed the differential, a sliding scale that maybe went up to about $1 a barrel, which took away the economic incentive to bring in and burn the dirty and dangerous oil. And lo and behold, the oil companies were able to, for the most part, meet the limit because they didn't want to bear the penalty from the fee. And in March or April of 73, when we closed the books on this, it turned out that instead of 25% of all the oil being non-conforming, which is what the oil companies had, they had said, you need to write us a variance. Well, how much are you going to need? Oh, about 25% of this winter's oil, you're going to have to exempt us. Well, only 2% of the oil was non-conforming. So that was kind of my conversion moment where I kind of saw the potential power of a tax or a price to change incentives and change behavior. And so I just have to say right off the bat, Nathaniel, when you say that no pollution tax has been used to reduce pollution, I think that's just not the case. We saved thousands of lives. Now, it sort of took me 8 or 10 years, of kind of mental growth to realize the import of that moment. And then, we had the climate summer of 1988 with global warming finally getting on the front pages. And at around that time, I began to be interested in the idea of a carbon tax. I even wrote a little op-ed piece in the Washington Post that ran in March of 1989 and, sank like a stone because it wasn't connected to any political expression. And I waited for almost 20 years for the environmental groups, the groups I had worked for and joined and revered, like EDF and NRDC, to get behind a carbon tax as the obvious, simple, direct, clear, transparent solution. They chose instead to go ahead, in fact, to build on the successful, I grant you that, acid rain program with cap and trade, to embed that in the Kyoto architecture of 1997, and so to continue on that path. And by one of these little coincidences, in the same week, January 2007, 3 years ago, that I co-founded the Carbon Tax Center on less than a shoestring. That was the week that EDF and NRDC and maybe UCS established the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, which is a partnership between these major green groups and certain more enlightened corporations that at least believed in the imminent risk and dangers of global climate change. And so they had a political alliance to support cap and trade. And I would suggest, and I'll use the remainder of my time to argue, that 3 years later, it's time for EDF et al. To gracefully acknowledge defeat. That cap and trade, which had such great political momentum at that time and was in fact able to climb quite a considerable hump in the passage of the Waxman-Markey bill in the House last June, well, that was the high watermark, and it's never going to come back to that, or at least not in the time frame that's necessary. And not in the kind of economy-wide, robust legislation that at least was envisioned in Waxman-Markey. I think that you have had your opportunity. You have consumed great resources, you have consumed funding, and you have dominated the public discourse about how to put a price on carbon, and you have failed to win your objective. Now, some of this, let's be fair, is due to the shameless and disgraceful public disinformation campaign by the deniers, let's not call them skeptics. And it is true that if a carbon tax had had the resources politically that cap and trade had, that we would have been the ones to suffer politically. So I'm not, the fact that you were the first out of the box and the most prominent, that is not to be counted against the cap and trade idea. But I do feel that this path has failed, and let me sort of outline the reasons that I think it has failed and why a carbon tax might be able to succeed. The first is that the financial sector involvement, the dependence on cap and trade of a market, once an asset, because my goodness, 3 years ago to talk about markets and financial schemes and new financial instruments, I mean, that was valorized. That was the way the world was going. Half of the graduates of my alma mater and probably yours, Nathaniel, were all going into Wall Street. But now 3 years later, the worm has turned, and to be tied in with large, trillion-dollar global speculative markets, secondary markets, markets that are inherently almost impossible to regulate and govern because of their brilliant complexity. This is no longer an asset. This is a debit of the highest rank. And I do want to say that the idea, it was, Nathaniel, you characterized a carbon tax as you set the price and then markets respond. I may be splitting hairs, but I'm going to dissent from that. A carbon tax sets a price on carbon pollution, and markets don't respond, but rather institutions respond, investors respond, the culture responds. A carbon tax is not a market-based instrument. It is a price incentive. It is a way of encouraging or channeling or provoking better behavior by internalizing damage costs into the price. It does not involve markets. It does not require markets. I think that that's an important distinction. A carbon tax is not a market mechanism. I would say, second, that we can't save climate behind the public's back. And I think that to some extent, the effort of cap and trade has been a stealth effort to put a price on carbon without the public knowing it. And I understand the motivation. I've been a political animal, for 50 years since age 12 in the Kennedy-Nixon election. I know Proposition 13 from California in 1978. I know the totemic power of the T word in the United States. And in fact, any day now, I think I'm going to change the T to an F. And the F is a different three-letter word. It's James Hansen, the climatologist's preferred word, and I think he's right. It's a carbon fee. Now, that's not going to solve the problem, but it may brand it differently. And at the same time that we rebrand a carbon tax from a carbon fee, I think that we've got to lead with the dividend, the green check that a carbon tax or fee can provide. And this involves dividending 100%, or as close to 100% as we can achieve, of the carbon tax revenues to the American public. Not siphoning it off into complex complex schemes of making utility customers whole by funneling money to local electric utilities, not putting the money into R&D, not putting it into mass transit, not putting it even into bicycles, which I, every night say a thankful prayer for the people who invented the bicycle 150 years ago. None of the money should go into any of that. The market pull, oops, I used that M word, the economic incentive pull of a carbon tax will accomplish what those allocations are intended to. And with a carbon tax, since we will know the amount of the tax up front, and since we have some idea of the price elasticities. It's true we don't know them exactly, but we have a pretty good handle on them. We can calculate ahead of time what the revenues are going to be. You can't do that with a quantity-based system. So I can stand up here now and say that if the Larson bill, the bill proposed by Representative John Larson of Hartford, the fourth-ranking Democrat in the House, which provides for a $10 to $15 a ton carbon tax, that's per ton of CO2, being incremented every year, starting in 2012. If that were to be implemented, then in the year 2020, and if all that money were to go to every single person living in the United States equally, Warren Buffett gets the same amount as me, and I get the same amount as, the 2-week-old, born in whatever. We all get about $1,400 a year. And I can market that as the green check, and I can also create a constituency for that, because when the green check begins in the first year at $150 or $180 per person, or $600 or $700 per family, and obviously this is intended to offset what would otherwise be a regressive impact, then we create a constituency that is going to want more and more of that and might be willing to have it ramped up, the carbon tax level, at the rate we need. I contend that a carbon tax is far more harmonizable globally than cap and trade. It has never been explained to me. Given that our per capita use of CO2, of fossil fuels, is 5 times that of China and 15 times that of India, what is the fungibility of a cap in the United States? If we say 20% by 2020 or 80% by 2050, what is the moral basis upon which somebody in Indonesia or India or China or Brazil should be going down at the same rate? It's absurd, obviously. But there is some reasonable fungibility, I believe, to having a tax level. And if the tax levels are different from one country to another, we can rely upon the border adjustment mechanism to harmonize that. I'll next say that the carbon tax has a clear price trajectory. If it can be enacted with a 5-year or 10-year phase-in or ramp-up, the price is known ahead of time, so investment can count on that price, whereas with a cap and trade, the price has to be revealed by the market. And nobody is going to know, a head of household is not going to know with a cap that goes down at this rate what the price adder to gasoline is going to be 5 years from now. It's going to take some complex modeling, and of course, your model is going to be different from my model. But we need that clear price trajectory to drive the investment needed to decarbonize the economy. I have some other points. I know I'm running out of time. Actually, just on this point about the price, the economic meltdown that we've sort of had for the past 2 years has cheapened the CO2 reduction targets in the Waxman-Markey bill. I sort of played around with my carbon tax impact spreadsheet this morning before I came here, and I kind of did a calculation that the Waxman-Markey bill, based on sort of current emissions, would imply a price in 2020, I calculated, of $5 per 40 cents per ton every year. So that, in other words, a ramp up of that much, so that by 8 years after the startup, we'd be at about $50 or $55 per ton of CO2. I have a very conservative model. I don't allow offsets, et cetera. And I don't think, I'm not as much of a techno-optimist on wind, which I love, and solar, shoving all the coal out of the utility system. It's going to take a big price over a long period of time to do that. But then I did the interesting exercise, which is I dropped my rate of GDP growth by 1% per year. And that $5.40 per ton per year ramp up fell in exactly half. In other words, the revealed price in 2020, instead of being about $54 per ton, would be about $27 per ton. And nobody knows what the economic growth rate is going to be, over any period of time. We don't even know it for the next quarter. So how are aircraft manufacturers going to know how efficiently what resources to put into their next generation aircraft in order to be able to design them for energy efficiency? How are people going to make location decisions, behavior decisions? Nobody's going to know under a cap and trade system. And finally, I guess my last point is that a tax is congruent with the ecological value that the polluter pays. It is a profound ethical point that people, individuals and institutions, we all need to be responsible for the social and ecological consequences of our behavior. In the same way that the city of New York 38 years ago imposed a tax that would internalize some of the damage costs and protect public health, we need a tax on carbon in order to be consistent with, I think, fundamental ethical values of being responsible for the consequences of our behavior. So for that reason alone, if it were a toss-up, I think that we should go for the tax. Now, I know I haven't talked about the political problems. It is a very deep problem, but I will say that if our beloved green groups, I've been down to Washington a dozen times in the past 3 years talking to members of Congress, talking to their staffs, and what I hear from every single one of them is, how can we stick our necks out and support a carbon tax when we can't get our backs covered by the EDFs of the world? And I think it's time for EDF and its brethren to admit defeat and come on board and join the carbon tax camp. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we have had 4 presentations. They have a lot in common, and they have a lot that's not exactly in common. And I think now it's time to open for questions.
Very spirited discussion. Before the fisticuffs come out here on this tax versus cap question, perhaps there is an intermediate course that combines the best features of both approaches. There's a clear reason for having a cap, but I think that Charles provided good rationale for having a tax or a fee. The question is, could there be a mechanism that combined a cap and a fee or a tax? And what are the problems in doing that? Is it possible?
I'd like to take a couple of questions if they're somewhat related, and then we'll have some answers, and then Billy first, and then
This is the session. The session title is Global Solution or Country-Specific Solutions. So we put it in purposely. The reason is, can we think of that it will be very difficult to enforce a worldwide unique solution for this problem? Or we have no world government. So we have different countries' government and different traditions. Will not different regions and different countries choose different paths? Europe, I guess, more cap and trade and plus tax. That has been done in Germany and Sweden and going to be discussed in France. US probably more leaning politically toward cap and trade. Other regions, maybe energy efficiency, like Ernst was arguing for, and maybe other regions like developing economies leaning more toward renewable energy, because that's the better path. In other words, can one envision probably, or should one realistically envision that the different paths probably chosen by different countries and regions, or is there a global solution?
there was a question there, and then a question there, and then perhaps we'll have some comments from the panel.
This is a question for Nathaniel Keohane. I was lobbying on the 29th of June for Wax and Markey with One Sky, knowing that it wasn't going to give us much of what we needed. And I'd first like to ask, since on December 7th we effectively got the cap in this country with the regulation of carbon, what the market responses over the past quarter have been from the primary sources and drivers of emissions in this country. And second, if you could tell us a bit about the lessons about both price harmonization and the allocation of permits between both the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative as well as the proposals in the CLEAR Act.
Charles, I wanted to congratulate you. I'm over here. I wanted to congratulate you on your presentation. It was very convincing, probably due in part to the fact that you worked for one of the last ethical mayors in New York City, John Lindsay. Be nice if we could get back to that standard some decade. My question is, why are the Environmental Defense Fund people, and I guess NRDC, sticking with a dead horse why don't they just admit that they're wrong and do something constructive? Thank you.
Okay, we have 4 questions. Can we combine them? But there's lots more than just cap and trade and carbon tax. Many more strategies, and we have 2 questions directly to our 2 debaters. Let's start. Would you like to begin?
No, I better not.
Okay. Ernst, because one of these is directly to you.
With pleasure. I can't, of course, avoid also touching on some of the things Nathaniel has said, but I do it in a way, answering your question, to say that combinations are not only conceivable, but highly desirable. And let me make one distinction relating to Willy's remarks. On a global scale, as Professor Uzawa has very convincingly said, a common tax would be unfair, while a common cap would not be unfair. So I believe this is, it is a great difference. I mean, if we want a tax that burdens poor people in India with the same amount per kilowatt hour as we do for rich people in Germany or America, that would be utterly unfair. But if we define politically a common cap using the reasoning of IPCC or others, this is a good thing to do. But the logic of that, again, using the equity argument, would mean that there is no reason why an American or German has a bigger right to emit than a poor person in Bangladesh. That means we come back to what I was proposing this morning, the per capita equal emission rights. That's so much for the global side of it. While at the national level, we have got excellent experiences with taxes. I was chairman of the German Parliament's Environment Committee when we had the tax reform that stepwise increased petrol taxes and electricity taxes and reduced indirect labor costs, creating or saving roughly 300,000 jobs, making the economy richer. And there are at least 50 examples compiled by Hans Obschoor and others of fees or charges or others working in Europe and other countries that simply do a very good job in pollution control, in raising revenues, etc., etc. So your argument that it doesn't work is wrong. But
I'll answer you in a second.
it may be politically unfeasible in America, and that's fine. We in Europe can easily work with the European trading system for carbon and some taxes in some countries, in Sweden, Germany, and others, while you in America go by the logic that you are so eloquently defending. So I'm not in any way against your doing it, but I invite you to avoid negative languages about taxis that are perfectly working.
So, thank you for that, and let me start by clarifying what I meant, because I actually spoke very precisely and deliberately, but I think the implication of what I was saying probably didn't come through. What I said was that we have not seen a pollution tax that reduces emissions. And what I mean by that is not, so maybe what the phrase I left out is, I don't mean relative to business as usual. I don't mean they're lower than they otherwise would have been. I mean a declining path for emissions. I am not interested in going home and saying, we made the polluters pay, and I feel good about that. I'm interested, sorry, I'm responding now.
Sorry,
I will come back.
Nathaniel, the wastewater charge in Europe made Europe's rivers clean. It really removed the pollution from rivers.
So let me, so
Well,
So,
you call
okay,
it a tax
I will,
or a
here, let me,
charge.
so let me narrow down, let me narrow down my
Okay,
argument.
fine.
I will, and because I've also learned much about the Lindsay administration as well. I think it is true that that on a carbon tax, so I will accept
Okay.
your,
Okay.
and I was getting a little carried away because I knew that
No,
Charles
that's-
was going to
that's
get up and
fine.
beat me up a little. A carbon tax has not been levied
Okay.
that
fine.
has reduced CO2 emission. Now, I will anticipate the next point, which is that we also, in the U.S., have not yet instituted a cap-and-trade program that has reduced CO2 emissions, and I will take that point as well. But my argument is that for the large-scale air pollution problems, I will even tentatively go that far. For air pollution, I have not seen maybe I'll stand corrected on this one, I have not seen a tax that has, again, achieved a reduction in emissions. But let me get off of that point, because that was, I'll happily I'll even sort of stipulate for the purpose of this panel that I will withdraw that statement, okay? So, because I want to get on to answering Charles took a little bit of extra time partly to answer me, so just really briefly, the discussion about a dividend, I agree that a dividend would be a great idea. Now, I'm not stating that as a matter of EDF policy. EDF policy, we do support a dividend as part of a broader allocation mechanism, et cetera, et cetera. But a dividend is not the same thing as a tax. So I want to be very clear here. A discussion, you often hear, oh, carbon tax is going to be great because we can use the revenue for a dividend. Well, and in fact, the CLEAR Act that Senator Cantwell proposed is an example of a quantity-based instrument, a cap, that would generate revenue and return it in the form of a dividend. So the question about what we do with revenue that we raise from an instrument is an important question. That's a really important political question. That is separate from the question of whether we're using a tax or a cap-and-trade program. And I will say that on an observation of this country's tax laws does not instill in me a confidence that a tax is going to be a simple and transparent and easily done instrument. I think if you look at the history of tax reform in this country, you see that politics enter into taxes as well. And so the problem that you have when you look at allocation and you look at the messiness of cap-and-trade programs that have actually made their way onto the floor and passed, that messiness is a function of politics. And the messiness would be there even if you had a carbon tax. So let's focus on the question, do we want to put a cap on emissions or do we want to put a price on emissions? Briefly to address one remaining point, the importance of a clear price trajectory. Charles says, how are aircraft manufacturers going to make plans when they don't know what the price is going to be in 2020? How are aircraft manufacturers going to make aircraft when they don't know the price of jet fuel? We don't know the price of jet fuel next year. So how are we going to make aircraft, and how are we going to? The answer is markets are pretty good at driving innovation. There are instruments available to deal with price risk. Would it be better if there wasn't any price risk? Probably. But if you are an electric utility that's making a decision on a 40 or 50-year lifetime plant, do you care about the week-to-week, month-to-month volatility of prices? I don't think so. I think what you care about is a long-run, credible policy that's in place. You care about what is the direction of the price path. not is it up and down versus is it, smooth. And that is a very important point, and one that I think needs to be said. So let me get briefly to the questions that were raised. I think, Willie, to your question about country-specific versus global architecture, after all, is the title of the panel. I do think that it's appropriate for different countries to take different paths going forward, and I partly withdraw my point earlier because I do think, my strongest arguments really are on the political side. They really are about the U.S. And by the way, I think it is astonishing, just as an aside, I think it is astonishing to say that we should give up on a cap-and-trade program because it's already been 10 months since we passed a law since we passed a bill in one of the houses of Congress. And after all, I think it is really astonishing to be giving up on this now. And in terms of the political analysis, I will say, Charles, you said you've been down to the Hill a dozen times in 3 years. I've been down to the Hill a dozen times in 3 weeks, and I think that there is a sense of where this is going. So, but to get back to Willie's, because I'll have to have another drink of water soon. I think you can have different paths for different countries. Absolutely. The point I want to make about harmonization, and this answers one of Charles's points too, you don't need to harmonize the declining schedule. People don't have to agree. You don't have to have all countries saying we're all going to get 80% below by 50-50, we're all going to get 20. The beauty of a linked cap architecture internationally is that you don't need to make those harmonizations. What you need to do is link the systems. And if you link the systems and you have trading among the systems, the price will harmonize. And that gives you the cost effectiveness without the need for coordination. It also gives you distributional equity, because if you acknowledge that the caps are likely to be more stringent in the developed world, and there's likely to be flows of investment capital and emissions of revenue from emissions going to the developing world, that addresses distributional equity at the same time as you're addressing cost effectiveness. I got to finish up because you can combine a cap and fees. I think the point has been made. It's been done in Europe, and one of the things on the Hill it would currently under consideration would look like that. The key question to me is there still fundamentally a cap over the entire system so that you're guaranteeing that emissions go down?
Okay, Professor Uzawa.
I just want to say a few words. When we talk about, I'm sorry, emission tax system, what is important is which level of tax rate we shall adopt, and the proper way of deciding the tax rate for carbon tax system is that we use this concept of imputed price. That is, when we emit a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, what kind of damage would do this to the society? Not only today, but for the future, until this CO2 remains in the atmosphere. And this is very difficult to calculate. But under certain assumptions, it is possible that along the sustainable processes of economic development, this would be proportional to the per capita income of the country in which the emission is made. So that the basic assumption is that a tax rate would be different between the countries depending upon the stages of economic development. Now, then how to calculate this? Again, it's very difficult, but the basic assumption is that the per 1 ton of emission of CO2 would cause a damage to a particular society which concerns us. Then the trading emission trading system presumes that this imputed price is identical for all countries involved, because the same price would be used to trade CO2 emissions between the countries. And this corresponds to the system of uniform carbon tax scheme. And in 1991, in Sweden, they introduced very vigorous carbon tax scheme. Average rate was about $500 per ton of CO2 emitted. And this at the time was regarded as maybe the minimum rate to which, by which atmospheric stability would be preserved. But $150 per ton means to the United States at the time, the per capita income about $30,000, and about per capita payment would be about $2,000. And that, in the case of Japan, about the same, but the per capita payment would be about 800. So this would be acceptable. But for developing countries, say for the case of Indonesia, per capita income was about $300, and the payment of 1 ton was emitted. So $150 for carbon tax payment would be hardly acceptable for the average income to be just $300. So my proposal of proportional carbon tax scheme is not only from optimum, from social, theoretical point of view, but also to be acceptable from political point of view. And so I feel that the uniform price would really damage the international harmony and damage the prospect of the development for developing countries. So that I propose this, and this trading CO2 emission market in the market means that you assume imputed prices are identical for all countries involved, and that is hardly acceptable from international point of view. Thank you.
We thank you very much. We are running.
Yes.
Do we have time for any more questions?
I think we should probably stop now.
Well, I would like to give the panel members each
Yes.
a minute or two to respond to each other and and to the general scene that we are. Let's start with Charles, who has been charmingly quiet.
Well, thanks. Charmingly quiet for a change. I went way over my limit. I went over the cap, so we'll have to have some internal money transfers here, and I do apologize for that. I just want to make sort of 2 points. The social damage costs of carbon are of great interest, and yet, from my standpoint, they're, and I'm going to overstate a point, they're almost irrelevant to the policy of not just carbon tax versus cap and trade, but how high a tax should we have, or how steep a declining cap should we have? In most of my work, I do traffic and transportation modeling, and I've calculated that an average trip by car into the center of Manhattan from 10 or 15 miles away costs about $100 worth of social costs, almost all of which is time delays to other travelers. Now, am I going to propose a $100 per trip congestion price? Of course not, because that would be politically completely impossible, and it would kind of overshoot what you want. And I think the same might sort of pertain here. I think we can all agree that whatever tax or cap the system provides, or that we're able to get, is going to be less than what we want. And what we've all got to do is unite and advocate for the most stringent cap or tax that we can that we can get out of the system. The other point, though, is about, in terms of, again, international harmonization. I'm a little confused, Ernst, by the question of you know, a citizen of India versus the citizen of the United States, because the way that I envision it, and maybe I've got something wrong, is that a carbon tax in India would generate money within India, and then it is the job of the Indian political system to distribute the revenues, and hopefully in a way that eliminates the intra-India regressive nature of the tax. But that there's no, I don't see, and I may be missing something, how there is a conflict between the sort of the fate of the populace of India versus that of the United States if the carbon taxes are national rather than international, because all of the money is staying within each country.
And now.
So thank you. I'll try to keep it brief since I went on for a long time last time. I just first briefly on the sort of the tax versus cap. I think it's useful actually to separate these arguments into two bins or two categories, because there's one set of arguments that are about sort of a political political analysis or political speculation or betting, or so on when I wear my advocacy hat, it's coming down on what do you think is more likely to get something passed, and following that. I think there's another bin of arguments on what the merits of the two approaches are on economic grounds, on the international harmonization grounds, and part of what I always get a little carried away when I'm being stimulated by someone like Charles, and I think we should take our show on the road. I think that would be great. But from that perspective, sort of putting my economist hat on, part of what I want to conclude with or leave people with is I think there are some very strong arguments on the merits for considering a quantity-based program. The last thing I'll say is I thought Professor Uzawa's point is very interesting, one I'll have to go back and think more about, because the principle of cost-effective emissions reduction does call for a uniform price. And the standard line, as I said, is, well, you can achieve the distributional equity by adjusting the caps and effectively having capital flows come through trading. But of course, that presumes that the flows that trade, the money that flows to China or India or developing countries actually reaches the citizens, who are, as Professor Uzawa pointed out, would be actually paying a higher price on the margin. And that is a very critical assumption if you're going to talk about distributional equity. And I think it's one that those of us who call for the simplicity of harmonization for international sort of cap and trade programs would do well to keep in mind.
Thank you. Ernst.
I definitely liked Nat's statement about a long-term consistency of policy, and if that can be done under the political conditions in America with cap and trade, fine, great. We need that consistency if we want a chance of bringing about the necessary paradigm shift in technology. I, for one, believe that under the conditions in Europe, that is much easier achievable with a tax system which, other than the previous taxes, is linked to the productivity gains, because that is something all parties can accept. So it's not vulnerable to government change. On Charles wondering what I meant, I'd say I'd be very happy seeing a global agreement on eco-taxes coming. But that should not impose on poor countries like Namibia or Bangladesh the kind of tax level per kilowatt hour that we would tolerate in Europe. That was essentially what I was saying. But if the world climate policy agrees on a world cap on CO2, I'm suggesting that an individual Namibian or Indian has no lesser right than an individual Texan or Bavarian to use the atmosphere. So Texans and Bavarians would have to go shopping to Bangladesh. And that would be the beginning in Bangladesh of considering efficiency instead of additional coal power plants.
Thank you.
I have said enough.
You've said it. There's wonderful. Thank you very much.
5 minutes break, then we continue.
Yeah, let's give applause.